Hello, and welcome, students of MACS 110, Introduction to Mass Communication Theory, in the first of a series of video presentations of the lectures to conclude this term of the course in the face of the inability to maintain face-to-face lectures for these last few. This will be lecture 9 on symbolic interactionism, taken largely from the first part of chapter 10, which was assigned reading for this segment of the course. And as an accompaniment to this video, the PowerPoint presentation that I would have uploaded to or would have displayed in class, in fact, I will upload to the weekly materials on the Blackboard LMS, where you came across the link to this video. However, I will also indicate verbally throughout this video lecture the appropriate time to switch to the next slide, and I will also integrate images of those slides into this series of lecture videos as well. So you'll have both resources available to yourselves for review and understanding. And so without further ado, I'll just launch right into the material for this lecture and see how long it might take us to get through it in the video format rather than in the face-to-face format that we have been used to. So today, like I said, we're going to look at the first part of chapter 10 regarding primarily the theory of symbolic interactionism as one way of understanding cultural meaning making in the media. But we may also look at some bits of chapter 11 before this series of videos for this week's class is done in order to assist you in writing your TED Talk review, which is due in the upcoming weeks. And so, as I said, at this point, I'll invite everyone to switch to the second slide in the PowerPoint presentation for this lecture. So chapter 10 begins by pointing out that it will begin to combine many of the theories we've looked at so far into a new understanding of cultural studies. Now, this makes sense since, as we've discussed several times, in the 21st century, it's pretty much the case that media equals culture. They're very much the same thing as we live in this ubiquitous media culture of the last 20 years. However, cultural studies has moved past its opposition to political economy. We looked at this opposition where cultural studies was very much about meaning making at the level of the audience or the individual audience member to media content, whereas political economy was more concerned with the structures and industry that constrain what content comes available. And so again, cultural studies has moved past this opposition as defined as mere reception studies into what the chapter refers to as both, quote, culture-centered and, quote, practices of meaning-making, and neither of which exclude the controls and limits placed on these activities from above, so to speak, that political economy would so vehemently remind us of. Now, symbolic interactionism, which is introduced on page 302, is the theory that people give meaning to symbols and that those symbols, those meanings, come to control those people. The control level of symbolic interactionism being sort of the political economy element of it. So, set in contradistinction against early theories of behaviorism, which is really nothing more than negative or positive acquired behavior, human acquired behavior through negative or positive stimulus response, often theories that were actually adopted through experiments on animals, the most famous of which is probably Pavlov's dog, in which when he rang a bell, the dog would salivate for food. And the earlier name for symbolic interactionism was actually social behaviorism. And that's defined as a view of learning that focuses on the mental processes and the social environment in which learning takes place more broadly. Now, on page 302 to 3 of the chapter, it makes extensive reference to a theorist named Mead and his baseball analogy. And in this analogy, team members learn by watching various roles of the baseball team and learning their particular role with variations. And but the chapter points out there are shortcomings to this analogy. It ignores the political economic power structures that might be controlling who is on the team. It likens, so it uses the example of what about the owner of the team, the cultural capital of the team, the coach, the owner of the baseball diamond on which they're playing and practicing. And another weakness that it points out in Mead's baseball analogy is that it really ignores the mediated nature of interaction. That is to say, when you're learning how to play baseball on a baseball diamond with other members of your baseball team, very rarely is that through any form of media. He gives the funny example that we don't learn to play baseball by reading theory about playing second base. Now, in Mead's 1934 text, Mind, Self, and Society, he argues that we use symbols to create our experience of consciousness, the mind, our understanding of ourselves, the self, and our knowledge of the larger social order, society. So mind, self, and society. In other words, symbols mediate and structure all our experience because they structure our ability to perceive and interpret what goes on around us. And this argument is quite similar to the one made by information processing theorists that we looked at in Chapter 8, if you care to review those theories as a way of sort of underpinning your understanding of this one. Now, according to Mead, human perceptual processes are extremely malleable and actually can be shaped by the sets of symbols we learn, so that we will see only what our culture has determined is worth seeing. That is to say, we tend to filter out a lot of media content or even visual social content based on what we have been perhaps behaviorally conditioned to recognize unconsciously as having social merit. Now, the textbook gives the example. For example, has your perception of Middle Eastern cultures changed? The United States' involvement in Iraq and Afghanistan, for example. The textbook asks, following the events of 9/11 or some of the alarmist statements made by particularly government officials in the United States following that catastrophic moment in time, are you since then more likely to notice a woman wearing a headscarf, for example, as though the point is that headscarves were not uncommon in North American culture, but they've taken on new symbolism. And the textbook goes on to ask, for example, what mental images today spring to mind when you hear the word terrorist? And it points out that while today it tends to be associated quite specifically with Islamic radicalism, that not much more than 20 years ago, the image might actually have been of, for example, an Irish Republican Army bomber or a Latin American drug criminal, but now it's almost specifically and exclusively associated with the Middle Eastern male. And the text then goes on to ask, about the American flag, which might have different meanings for a diverse population of students and instructors that we have at UFV, but it asks, consider the meaning that you attach to the stitched red, white, and blue cloth that constitutes an American flag. A flag is really, in reality, objectively, little more than a piece of colored cloth, but of course, through all sorts of symbolic interactionism and social construction, we come to associate different things with that cloth depending on our political perspectives and perhaps the ideology in which we grew up. So at this point, I'll ask you to switch to slide number 3 in the accompanying PowerPoint presentation to this lecture as we continue our discussion of symbolic interactionism and the theories of Mead. Now, at this point, on page 305 of the textbook, it moves to look at the sources from which Mead drew his theorizations of symbolic interactionism, particularly what's been referred to as pragmatism and the Chicago School that we looked at in a previous lecture. Now, Mead developed symbolic interactionism by drawing on specifically the ideas of pragmatism. We looked at this, like I said, in chapter 3, when we considered the argument they made concerning, the Chicago School made concerning social responsibility of the press. Now, these ideas, pragmatism and social interactionism, were both at the heart of that what we called normative theory in terms of looking at the functions of the press rather than perhaps some of its more disconcerting social ramifications. Now, pragmatism was drawn from a theorist named John Dewey, actually. And it's defined as a school of philosophical theory emphasizing the practical function of knowledge as an instrument for adapting to reality and controlling it. And in that, you can hear clear echoes of post-positivism and certainly of the scientific method in general. Again, the practical function of knowledge as an instrument for adapting to reality and controlling it. Now, if we consider Mead's argument carefully, it suggests that individuals do have some control over what they do, but Mead is really arguing that agency lies with the community, or in his baseball example, with the team. That is to say that communities, rather than individuals, create and propagate culture, those complex sets of symbols that guide and shape our experience. Now, the Chicago school theorists in the 1920s, they used the term great community to refer actually to all of the city of Chicago. And the textbook points out, I think wisely, that it's useful to contrast this term with another term that's used quite a bit in the textbook, the term mass society. And the difference between great community and mass society highlights some key differences between pragmatism and mass society theory, between a theory that's optimistic about the future of large-scale social orders, that would be the great community, and one that's quite pessimistic, that would be mass society. Mass society theorists worried that individuals would become atomized in large-scale social orders, high culture would give way to mass culture, so people's existence would inevitably be degraded and dehumanized. By contrast, if mass societies are places where human existence is degraded, great communities, according to pragmatism and the Chicago School, are places where the potential for human existence is explored and new opportunities for developing culture are found. And so now I'll ask you to switch to the fourth slide in the accompanying PowerPoint presentation entitled Current Applications of Symbolic Interactionism, which begins on page 307 of the textbook. And the textbook tells us that Don Falls and Dennis Alexander in 1978, basing their analysis on their definition of communication as quote, symbolic behavior that results in various degrees of shared meaning and values between participants, close quote. They offered three fundamental propositions on symbolic interaction and communication. And the first of these is that people's interpretation and perception of the environment depend on communication. That is to say that our construction in our minds of the society and environment in which we live is hyper-dependent on the symbols of communication that we use to understand it through our development. The media are a prime source of indirect experience and for that reason have significant impact on the construction of social reality. Now, their second proposition is that communication is guided by and guides the concepts of self, role, and situation. And these concepts generate expectations in and of the environment. So, for example, your self-definition of student is hyper-dependent on an entire society agreeing to some degree, even if it's arbitrary, it certainly is tacitly widespread, agreeing to some degree what that means and what is expected. And the third proposition that Falls and Alexander make is that communication consists of complex interactions involving action, interdependence, mutual influence, meaning, relationship, and of course situational factors. That is to say that when you have two identities speaking to each other, the very situation they're in may change the political economy, the power structures, and the very meaning making that those participants participate with. And the textbook then points out that here we can see not only a communication-oriented restatement of Solomon's precepts 3 and 4, but also a rearticulation, more importantly, of James Carey's ritual perspective, which sort of looks at our consumption of media as a social ritual rather than something imposed on us as mass society theory would have it. And of course, if you'd like to review James Carey's theory, we reviewed that in chapter 5 of the textbook. Now, at this point, I'd like you to switch to slide 5 of the accompanying PowerPoint presentation, as we have an opportunity now that we have sort of a general understanding of where the idea of symbolic interactionism came from and its basic precepts and notions, to look at some of the specific definitions that this theory gave rise to. And it's important that we get our handle on these, mainly because the similar terminology is used in other theories we're going to look at shortly, but they have specifically different meanings. So under symbolic interactionism, a sign is any element in the environment used to represent another element in the environment. And here we certainly have echoes of Saussurean linguistics here. And this could be a word, an image, a written word, a sound even, in which we come to recognize what is being symbolized through the sign. So for example, if I went moo, generally people in Western culture would consider that to be a sort of a stylized version of the sound that a cow makes. Now, natural signs, under the heading of signs, there's a couple of categories. Natural signs are things occurring in nature that represent something else in nature. So, for example, if leaves turn yellow, we can consider that its fall is underway or is imminent. And on a broader scale, an example that's not given, we certainly see images in the media of dried landscapes and gigantic images, satellite images of hurricanes, which don't necessarily just mean dry weather or wet weather. They're indicators of climate change. Now, in contradistinction to natural signs are artificial signs, and in symbolic interaction, these are elements that have been constructed to represent something else in the social world. A handshake or a bow as a formal way of greeting a new colleague. And they're highly culturally specific. For example, a handshake is generally in Western culture. A bow might be from more traditional Eastern cultures or Asian cultures. And this becomes very, very obvious, for example, to me in a movie like, let's say, The Ring, which was adapted from a Japanese original, remade by a Hollywood company, to the movie, the horror film The Ring. And when I first watched the horror film The Ring, I must admit I was a little bit baffled, because the symbols that the movie was deploying, while they were in some ways disturbing in their own right, I wasn't particularly frightened on a cultural level by long-haired little girls or wells or dead horses. And this is an example of the cultural specificity of artificial signs. In terms of what we understand as Halloween in Western culture, of course, there's the typical symbols of bats and witches and vampires and haunted houses and spiders and their ilk, which are the culturally specific set of artificial signs in Western culture that represent Halloween. And this set of terms continues beyond signs, natural signs, and artificial signs, and goes on to define signals, which in symbolic interaction are artificial signs that produce highly predictable responses in society. And the example it gives is a traffic signal. When the light turns red, generally we can relatively safely assume everybody who is facing that light will stop. And when the light turns green, it's our opportunity to move forward. And occasionally, when those expectations are subverted, we're met with catastrophic results, car accidents, which can be fatal. And the last term that's important under symbolic interaction is the term symbols, which used in this body of theory is also a subcategory of artificial signs. for which there is certainly less certainty of a response. So unlike a red light, which will generally everyone will stop just because it's pragmatic and safe, there might be very, very different responses to the American flag, whether you see it as a symbol of patriotism, a symbol of imperialism, or a symbol of capitalism, for example. And Falls and Alexander explained signals are used to regulate normative behavior in society, like a traffic signal, and symbols are used to facilitate communicative behavior in a society, as in discussion about what does the American flag really mean. Now, these definitions in particular were set in opposition to similar definitions under the theory of social constructionism, which I'll take up on slide 6, and in the next video. I'll cut this one here in order for there to be some degree of brevity in each contribution to the series of videos that will make up the lecture for this week's class. So I'll encourage you now to take a bit of a break and then come back to the second video for lecture 9 on where we will take up the idea of social constructionism on slide number 6.